Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our now continuing discussion of the effects of Napoleon, right? So the biggest thing that we've been talking about in this class, leading up to this leading up to the stuff that we'll discuss in this flip, is basically what's going to go down and what's going to happen after Napoleon has been exiled, right? And we started talking about how Europe is going to have to come together, politically speaking, and decide what the front door they're going to do. Now, this unit can get really confusing because we are going to go into this whole immediate effects of Napoleon. Then we're going to rewind and we're going to talk about Napoleon's effects on the world, right? And then we're going to go back to Europe and we're going to talk about these political perspectives and how they were kind of eking out there, right? Now, I know that might be frustrating. I know that might be intense, but you just got to kind of stay along with the narrative, right? Just understand that we are right now talking about what happened in Europe immediately after Napoleon and during the era of the Industrial Revolution, right? And then we're going to rewind and basically be like, how did Napoleon affect the rest of the world, right? And then we'll fast forward again and basically discuss how that's going to change things dynamically going forward, okay? Now, big thing we got to get into, though, is we got to pick up right where we left off in class, talking about the Congress of Vienna. Now, we're talking about the Congress of Vienna and the meeting of the minds of these old conservatives and stuff like that to try and recreate the balance of power in Europe, right? And we were discussing very, very recently in our last class, where we were talking about the goal of the Congress of Vienna was to split up everything that Napoleon took over and give control of Europe back to the people that had traditionally had control, right? The big absolutists and the powerful nations, including Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, right? These larger empires that had the biggest sway throughout most of the continent, right? Now, what we need to understand, though, is that Russia, Austria, and Prussia at the time were considered very conservative, right? They were considered very conservative, all right? Now, going into it, though, we have to understand that conservatives at the time really, really, really hated maps that looked like this, right? Things that look like this freak the conservatives out, right? That right there is Nicki Minaj. That right there is techno music. That right there is aggressive and over the top. Because the Empire of France has taken over Spain. It's taken over what was the Holy Roman Empire and destroyed it and turned it into the Confederation of the Rhine. Taken over the Austrians, created a puppet state out of the Prussians, and even also taken over what was known as Poland and turned it into the Duchy of Warsaw, right? That right there is when Napoleon took over nearly 85 to 90% of Europe, right? And with him came the ideas of the Revolution. With him came the ideas of the Enlightenment. With him came the ideas of what basically scared the daylights out of conservatives. And what they wanted was a return to that. They wanted a return to when they were all in power, right? When France knew its place, when Prussia had the old conservatives in power, when the Austrians ruled over all these other people, when the Russians were heavily in power. You gotta understand that this is what they wanted, right? Because the conservatives loved absolutism. The conservatives loved Catholicism, being involved in politics. They loved the ideas of a very, very strong Christian-backed, like king or queen ruling over everything, right? Which when we look at through the modern lens is not really what anybody wants, right? So going into it, you have to understand that there are three big political isms that are going to begin to rise up when like Napoleon gets exiled, right? And the ideas of industrialism are beginning to eke out there, right? And what you're going to see is this weird mashup of people being like, oh, well, we should be ruled this way, or oh, we should be ruled that way, right? And so our first ism that we got to talk about is none other than conservatism, right? And the goals of conservatism are these, right? And I know that y'all are like, wow, this is really, really big and beefy, okay? It is a long description, but you have to understand that basically this lines up with the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class, right? The upper class people that even still existed post-industrial revolution and after Napoleon were the ones that were the greatest affected by the Napoleonic Wars, right? They wanted to come back into power, and they favored absolutism, right? They wanted to restore the Bourbon monarchy to France. They wanted to get rid of Napoleon. They're the ones who decided to exile him a second time to St. Helena, and they are in favor of absolutists, right? Because that's what they know, and they want to conserve the old way. They want to keep things the way they always have been, right? They want to conserve everything that they used to have, right? That is their goal in the ideas of conservatism, right? They favor that absolutist authority. They want to suppress any new revolutions that might pop up because new ideas scare them, right? They want to prevent and destroy any constitutions that could potentially pop up because what do constitutions do? They give people Enlightenment-style rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man would terrify a conservative, right? They'd be like, wait, we got to let people have freedom of speech? Wait, we got to let them have freedom of religion? But that could take us further out of power. And literally, they don't want those documents to pop up, right? They want to stop the growth of legislative bodies because legislative bodies means that people have the ability to vote. And it means it's injecting the ideas of the general will and Rousseauian logic into society, right? They like the idea that no one really votes. They don't really want anyone to vote. And that's what that's referred to as suffrage, right? They want little to no suffrage if possible. They want to keep the money in the elite classes. They want to keep the money and power within the hands of the old nobles and the monarchs of Europe. And they want to do that by enforcing mercantilism, which we know is a bad idea for economies, and it's beginning to die off, right? They want to tell you you have to buy in this country. They want to tell you that you can't buy from England because that's a big competitor of theirs, right? And they want heavy government involvement in the economics, right? And who likes this? The old nobles and the aristocrats. And who is the best representation of this? This guy right here, right? Jot this man's name down. He is a man by the name of Clemens von Metternich, right? K-L-E-M-E-N-S, Clemens von Metternich. And Metternich spelled M-E-T-T-E-R-N-I-C-H, right? Clemens von Metternich was a prince from the Austrian Empire, and he saw the destruction that Napoleon's rule and then also the Napoleonic Empire and also what the French Revolution was doing, and it was taking people like him out of power, right? Prince Metternich benefited from feudalism. He benefited from the old ways. He benefited from absolutism because the absolutists liked him, and also, if an absolutist died, his family might be next up because he's a royal high-ranking noble, right? He believed that giving people rights was a really good pathway to revolution and a destruction of everything good and peaceful in his mind. Now, when we look at Clemens von Metternich in the modern era, we're like, you're dumb, dude. You're dumb. It's a terrible idea. Having an absolutist is a terrible thing. Giving people rights in a constitution is a good thing, right? And when we look at him, though, he is like the conservative superhero because he is the one, if you want to write down some little extra stuff, that led that Congress of Vienna. He was the representative of the Austrian Empire. He stood at the table being like, everyone will get this, you will get that. France, shut up and sit over there. And so literally he was the one that was like, we need to bring the monarch back to France, right? So yes, Gretchen Bassel, I hate to break it to you, they brought Louis XVI's brother back in as King of France. And it was all because Clemens von Metternich was the guy that came up with it. Another famous one is a guy named by the name of Edmund Burke, who is actually from England and stuff like that, and he's also a conservative advocate there as well. Now, another big ism that pops up during this time, their main enemy are these people known as classical liberals. Now, we talked about this a little bit in class today, that when you have a political spectrum in the modern era, you basically have lumped off to one side and the other, the ideas of conservative over here and liberals over here, right? Well, the interesting thing about it is that is not an old way of looking at things. It's actually, or excuse me, not a new way of looking at things. It's actually rather old, right? And so the next ism that we're talking about is classical liberalism, right? So we have conservatism, and now we have classical liberalism. Now, why do I add the word classical on there? You have to call them classical liberals because classical liberals are now modern-day conservatives, right? Conservatives actually, in the modern era, would love the ideas of a classical liberal, right? And they were called classical liberals, and we have to call them that so we don't get the waters all muddied, right? So going into it, you have to understand the goals of classical liberals was to, one, grow the industrial era and keep pushing for economic growth because classical liberals believed in a dog-eat-dog, every man for himself, individualized idea of society. They thought that if every person did right for themselves, then society would progress forward at an exponential rate. So they believed that if you over there went off and started your own business and got after it and made money, then great for you, right? And the idea of every man for himself. Now, when we're looking at this, what type of economics does that favor? They loved laissez-faire economics, which means little to no government intervention, right? Low taxes, if any at all, and then also capitalism. They love the idea of capitalism because it puts the money in the hands of individuals, and then it makes it so the government only taxes enough to provide for itself, a defense, and the common good of people, right? They also want to limit the power of monarchs. They want a constitution. A big thing that we need to understand about it is they believe in constitutions. Write that down somewhere. They really believe, oh no, it's right here. They want to expand suffrage to more people, not all. They don't want everyone to vote because they're like, poor people don't know how to vote with anything but their stomach. That's a famous line that they would always say. They would always be like, oh, poor people vote with their stomachs, right? Saying, oh, they'll vote for anybody that gives them food, right? So they want to expand suffrage and voting to more people in the middle class. And they want to outline those rights in the constitutions, and they want their natural rights. So they believe in the ideas of John Locke, right? The ideas of life, liberty, and property. They want to expand legislative bodies. They want British-style government. They want a parliament with an upper and a lower house that represents the people, that will give rights to people and function as the intermediary of how tax money is spent. Not to be spent on an absolutist, but to be spent on the common good and kept low enough to where it isn't touching people's profits, right? They also want to grow the wealth in the common classes of society. And who likes this concept? The middle class, right? The middle class and the bourgeois from France. They love this concept. They love the ideas of Adam Smith, who outlined the ideas of capitalism in his book called The Wealth of Nations. And a person that represents a classical liberal is none other than the Marquis de Lafayette, right? A noble himself, but who actually believed in the ideas of the Enlightenment in the French Revolution, and that the people of France needed a constitution to outline their basic rights, to make sure that no monarch or noble was taking them away, right? And he was a noble himself, right? And another big famous classical liberal you could look at is Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson helped the Marquis de Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And he himself wrote the Declaration of Independence and helped write the Constitution of the United States of America, right? Those are your classical liberals, those middle-class people who want to do all those different things, right? And then your third ism that's going to be very, very important, that's going to scare the bejesus out of everybody, are the socialists, right? The socialists that are going to begin to pop up in the late 1800s, right? Now, the goals of socialism is highly different from the other two isms, and it scares both of them to death, right? The goal of socialism is to move away from individualism and more towards a collective, right? It's the idea that we are all in this together and that we should have smaller communities, not these massive cities, and that they also believe in the idea that every man contributes to society, right? And when they contribute their goods and their labor, then they will then receive from their government and their fellow brothers in arms other goods that they need, right? So in these smaller communities, you had some utopian socialists that were actually started by this guy, Henri de Saint-Simon, who believed that literally small little cities where they didn't even really use money and private property was abolished and everyone shared everything would be a more peaceful existence. They also believe that in these communities that everyone should be allowed to vote because they believe in universal suffrage, not limited suffrage like the classical liberals did. They also believe that you should get rid of kings altogether. No more kings whatsoever, that legislative bodies should be completely in control. See what I'm talking about, that variant scale? Classical liberals believed, like, keep a king, it's fine, but he needs to be a constitutional monarch, right? And then the conservatives are like, oh no, absolute monarch, right? Socialists are like, how about no king at all, right? Like, no king at all, that is just a vestige of the old upper class, right? They're like, instead, let the parliament be completely in charge, right? They also want a planned economy, right? They want a planned economy where basically there's no competition, no capitalism, where everyone has certain roles, they all do work that they enjoy, and then also going into it as well, the socialists believe that there should be planned economics for goods and services that everyone needs, right? For example, a socialist idea would be setting the price of bread, right? Or a socialist idea at the time would be like universal health care, right? Which a lot of these other figures are actually going to gravitate towards later on because you got to give them something to keep them from getting all freaked out and then burning stuff down in the streets. They also want natural rights, except the private property one because they want to like limit it as much as they can. They want to redistribute wealth and goods in society. And who likes this concept? None other than the industrial lower class and the lower end of the middle class, right? Because there's a lot of different types of socialists. A lot of people, when they actually want to know where socialism came from, a lot of them point the finger to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? They talk about how he wants like everyone to move out into the woods, provide for themselves, to educate their own children and things like that. And so we believe that he might be that earliest form of a socialist, like a proto-socialist, right? Now this guy, though, is going to take socialism 2 steps further, and that guy is none other than Karl Marx, right? Write that name down, Karl Marx, K-A-R-L-M-A-R-X, right? Karl Marx actually took socialism a step further and said, no, we need to have communism. And he's going to actually create the idea known as communism outlined in his book known as the Communist Manifesto, right? So he's going to be an important figure though going forward. So do me a favor, write down Karl Marx, right? Because he's going to be very important. Now going into it, we need to understand though, that we're not writing any of this, not writing any of that, right? Not writing any of that. No. So here we go. What we need to understand that we're now moving into, though, is we're talking about the effects of Napoleon and the French Revolution on an international scale, right? So what we're going to be doing now is, this is a big title in your notes, we are going to be rewinding back into history when Napoleon was still alive and in power in France. And some of you are like, why are we talking about that political agents? We're going to bring those political business back around. I like to talk about them first so we can review them a bunch every day to make sure that you understand what they like, right? And so the thing about it, though, is we're now rewinding back to talk about how the French Revolution and Napoleon had effects even on places like North and South America, and how it's going to take North and South America from looking like this when it was controlled by the British and Spain and also controlled by like Portugal in different areas, and it's going to be moving more towards this concept with different countries based on national ideologies and a shared cultural value, right? So the thing that we're going to first talk about, though, before we get into anything else, is going to be the background of a very important place. You have to understand that in North and South America, when we're looking at it, the background of the entire thing is the native people that were originally there were the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and the various other tribes of Northern and Southern America, including, for example, the Northern indigenous tribes. In this area, you had like the Bayagula and the Homa natives, right? Then European colonization is going to take place in the 1500s, mostly by Spain, Portugal, and France, and then later on as well, Great Britain, right? Now, in our timeline, though, from the 1500s forward, you had, like, the English Revolution, which I'm basically meaning the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, which happened in 1688, which inspired the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment then inspired the American Revolution, which inspired the French Revolution, which will then inspire Latin American independence movements and this thing called self-determination in Europe, right? So what you're going to see happen, though, is this sequence of events where literally the Glorious Revolution, that bloodless overthrow of the king when no one died, inspired the Enlightenment, which inspired this revolution, which inspired that revolution, is going to inspire other people to have countries of their own and to liberate themselves from other areas. And what we need to understand when we're looking at that is that it's going to cause a very massive revolution in a place that you now know of as modern-day Haiti, right? But to understand this whole process, what self-determination is the process by which many countries and cultural groups are determining its own statehood and form its own allegiances and its own government. Because you have to understand there were too many ethnic groups and cultures in too few countries. But we're going to pick up right there when we get back into class, and I'll see y'all soon.